The Whitmore estate stood like a silent monument on Chicago's North Shore. Built from polished gray stone and surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges, the mansion rose 3 stories high, its tall windows reflecting the cold lake winds that rolled in from Lake Michigan. To outsiders, it looked like the kind of home people dreamed about: grand, elegant, and powerful. But for Sarah Whitmore, it had never truly felt like home. To her, the mansion felt more like a museum, beautiful, quiet, and carefully arranged, but never warm. She had lived inside those walls for 20 years, yet there were days when she still felt like a visitor walking through someone else's life. Sarah had just turned 60 when her husband, Robert Whitmore, passed away after a sudden and devastating illness. His death shocked the entire city of Chicago. Robert Whitmore had been one of the most powerful real estate developers in the Midwest. Tower cranes across the skyline had once moved at his command, and many of the city's tallest glass towers carried his company's name. To the public, Robert Whitmore was admired, a brilliant businessman who could transform empty land into fortunes. To the corporate world, he was something else entirely. He was feared. Deals closed when he entered the room. Competitors stepped aside when he decided he wanted something. His reputation for ruthless negotiations had become almost legendary. But to Sarah, Robert had always been more complicated than the man the world believed him to be. When they first met, she had been working quietly at a community charity event. Robert had arrived late that evening, wearing one of his perfectly tailored suits, surrounded by assistants and business partners. Yet somehow, by the end of the night, the powerful developer had spent most of his time sitting beside her, asking about the garden she maintained in her small suburban backyard. They married 2 years later. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. A powerful businessman marrying a quiet, kind woman who seemed to want nothing from his wealth. But life inside the Whitmore mansion had never been simple. For 20 years, Sarah had moved quietly through Robert's world: charity galas, corporate dinners, holiday parties attended by politicians and CEOs. She learned how to smile politely at people who talked about stock markets and development projects she barely understood. She never tried to compete with that world. Her happiness had always been simpler. She found peace in the garden behind the mansion, where she planted roses and lilacs with her own hands. She cooked Sunday dinners in the enormous kitchen that most people only used for catered events. And most importantly, she raised her son, Noah Whitmore. Noah Whitmore was 15 years old, tall for his age, with dark hair that constantly fell into his eyes. Unlike his father, Noah hated the spotlight that came with the Whitmore name. He preferred quiet afternoons riding his bike through the neighborhood or helping his mother plant flowers in the backyard garden. For Sarah, Noah was the center of everything. But the fragile peace inside the Whitmore mansion had always been threatened by 2 people: Victoria and Chloe Whitmore, Robert's daughters from his first marriage. Both women were in their 30s now, confident, elegant, and impossibly sharp-tongued. They carried themselves like heirs to a throne they had been preparing to inherit their entire lives, and in many ways they had. The sisters had never forgiven their father for marrying Sarah after their mother passed away. In their eyes, Sarah was not a stepmother. She was an outsider. They never called her mom. They rarely even used her name with kindness. To them, she was simply Sarah. Their resentment lingered through every family dinner and every holiday gathering. Over the years, Sarah had learned to ignore their cold smiles and quiet insults. She told herself that staying silent kept the peace for Robert, and for Noah. But after Robert's death, the fragile balance that had held the family together collapsed almost immediately. The reading of Robert Whitmore's will took place on a gray Chicago morning. Outside the tall library windows, the sky hung heavy with clouds, and the lake wind rattled softly against the glass. Inside the mansion's formal library, the atmosphere felt even colder. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with rows of leather-bound books that Robert had probably never opened. The long conference table in the center of the room looked more like a corporate boardroom than a family gathering place. Sarah sat quietly at one end of the table. Across from her sat Victoria and Chloe. Both sisters wore black dresses, but their posture showed none of the grief expected at a funeral. Victoria sat with her arms folded, her sharp eyes fixed on the lawyer. Chloe leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, studying her phone as if she was waiting for a meeting to end. At the head of the table stood Robert Whitmore's longtime attorney, Mr. Daniel Harris. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and opened a thick folder. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His voice echoed softly in the large room. "As you know, Mr. Whitmore left detailed instructions regarding the distribution of his estate." Sarah folded her hands quietly in her lap. She had never cared much about Robert's wealth. She assumed the companies and buildings would go to Victoria and Chloe. That had always been expected. Still, something about the moment made her uneasy. Mr. Harris began reading. Robert's corporate shares, his downtown office towers, multiple real estate investment funds, luxury properties across the country, including the Whitmore vacation home in Aspen.
One by one, every major asset of the Whitmore empire was listed, and every single one of them was left to Victoria and Chloe. The sisters exchanged satisfied glances but said nothing. Sarah sat silently, barely hearing the rest of the lawyer's words. It didn't matter to her. She had never wanted Robert's empire. Then Mr. Harris paused. He cleared his throat again and looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully. The room seemed to grow still. "Per Mr. Whitmore's written instructions, you and your son Noah are required to vacate the Whitmore estate within 30 days. For a moment, Sarah thought she had misheard him. 30 days. The words echoed inside her mind. The only home Noah had ever known. Gone. Across the table, Chloe allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, watching Sarah as if waiting for her reaction. But Sarah remained silent. Mr. Harris reached into the folder and slid a small object across the table. It stopped in front of her with a soft metallic sound. A single tarnished brass key. Old and slightly worn, as though it had been used many times. "Mr. Whitmore asked this to be given to you," he voiced quietly. Then he slid a small piece of paper beside the key. "There is also an address." Sarah slowly picked up the paper. 2 simple words were written on it in Robert's handwriting. Whispering Pines. Sarah stared at the words, confused. She had never heard that name before. Across the table, Chloe spoke for the first time. "Well," she said with a small smile, "that's generous." Victoria gave a quiet laugh. And in that moment, Sarah realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before. For 20 years, she had lived inside Robert Whitmore's world. But she had never truly belonged to it. And now, with a single sentence in a lawyer's voice, that world was hers. The countdown began the moment the lawyer finished reading Robert Whitmore's will. 30 days. That was all the time Sarah and Noah had to leave the only home Noah had ever known. At first, the mansion remained quiet, as if the walls themselves were still absorbing the shock of Robert's absence. But that silence didn't last long. Within days, the Whitmore estate began to change.
Interior designers started arriving with rolls of blueprints tucked under their arms. Contractors walked through the hallways, measuring walls and ceilings. Landscapers appeared in the backyard with clipboards, pointing toward the gardens as if they were already planning how to erase them. It didn't take long for Sarah to realize what was happening. Victoria had already begun redesigning the house. The estate that Sarah had lived in for 2 decades was being treated like an empty property waiting for renovation. Workers moved freely through the halls, speaking loudly as they made plans. "Open this wall up," one contractor said in the dining room. "The lighting in here is outdated," another replied. "This whole area could be modernized." Sarah quietly packed boxes nearby, pretending not to hear them. But the moment that hurt the most came a few days later in the kitchen. She was carefully wrapping dishes in newspaper when she overheard Victoria speaking with a landscape designer by the window. Victoria stood with her arms crossed, staring out at the backyard. "I'm thinking we start fresh," she said casually. "Take everything out." The landscape designer nodded while studying the garden. That would definitely open up the space. Sarah's hands froze. Everything out? For 20 years, the garden behind the Whitmore mansion had been Sarah's refuge. It was the one place in the entire estate that felt like it truly belonged to her. Every rose bush had been planted by her hands. Every lilac tree had been chosen carefully. She knew exactly where the sun warmed the soil first in spring and where the last autumn light touched the flower beds. Victoria continued speaking as if the garden were nothing more than an outdated decoration. "I'm thinking an infinity pool," she said, "right there in the center." Chloe leaned against the counter, sipping coffee while she studied the yard. "And maybe a fire pit area for parties," she added with a small smile. "It'll look amazing at night." Neither sister acknowledged that Sarah was standing only a few feet away. She slowly folded another dish into a cardboard box and said nothing. But someone else heard the conversation. Later that afternoon, Noah burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with anger. "I just heard the landscapers," he said, his voice shaking. "They're talking about ripping out the garden." Sarah looked up quietly. Before she could answer, Victoria walked into the room. "What about it?" she said, raising an eyebrow. Noah turned toward her immediately. "You can't do that." Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "Excuse me?" Noah stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "My mom built that garden." The room went silent. Chloe watched from the counter with mild amusement. Victoria studied Noah for a moment before speaking again. "This is our property now," she said coldly. "We can do whatever we want with it." Noah took another step forward. Sarah moved quickly between them. "Noah," she said softly. "But Mom, it's not worth it." Her voice was calm, but there was quiet sadness behind it. Noah looked at her, frustration burning in his eyes. For a moment it seemed like he might argue again. Then he lowered his gaze and said nothing. Victoria simply turned and walked out of the kitchen as if the conversation had never happened. That night, the mansion felt emptier than it ever had before. Most of Sarah and Noah's belongings were already packed into boxes stacked along the walls. Without furniture and decorations, the long hallways echoed with every step.
The home that had once been filled with people and noise now felt like a hollow shell. Late that evening, Sarah found Noah sleeping on the living room couch. He was still wearing the same hoodie he had worn all day, one arm hanging loosely off the side of the cushion. When he slept, he looked younger. 15 suddenly seemed very small. Sarah sat quietly beside him. In her hand was the tarnished brass key the lawyer had given her. She turned it slowly between her fingers. The metal felt cold and worn as if it had been used for years. Whispering Pines. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard Aubrey mention it, not once in 20 years. It could be anything. A forgotten piece of land, a small cabin somewhere far away, maybe even something abandoned. But whatever it was all they had left. Sarah closed her fingers around the key and took a slow breath. For 2 decades, she had endured quiet insults and silent humiliation inside Robert Whitmore's world. She had done it to keep peace in the family, but that world was gone now. And as she looked at her sleeping son, a promise settled firmly in her heart. No matter where that key led them, she would rebuild a life for Noah, even if she had to start over at 60. 3 days after leaving the Whitmore estate, Sarah and Noah were still on the road. The drive out of Chicago had been long and quiet. At first, the busy highway stretched endlessly ahead of them, surrounded by crowded suburbs and tall office buildings. But as the hours passed, the scenery slowly began to change. The buildings disappeared, the roads grew narrower, the traffic faded until the highway became a simple 2-lane road cutting through miles of open countryside. By the time they turned onto a winding road surrounded by tall pine trees, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly. A noise of nervous anticipation had been growing in her chest during the entire drive. She had spent hours imagining what Whispering Pines might look like. A small wooden cabin, a rundown farmhouse, maybe even an empty piece of land that Robert had purchased years ago and forgotten. She had prepared herself for the worst. The old sedan rolled slowly down a gravel driveway lined with towering red maple trees and tall whispering pines. Their branches swayed gently in the cool autumn wind. Then the trees suddenly opened. Sarah pressed the brakes. The car came to a slow stop. "Mom," Noah said quietly. Sarah stared ahead in disbelief. Before them stood a sprawling stone estate. The house wasn't brand new, but it was beautifully maintained. It sat on a gentle hill overlooking wide-open fields, and in the distance a small lake reflected the fading light of the evening sky. A wide front porch wrapped around the entire house. Smoke drifted lazily from a tall stone chimney. The entire place looked peaceful, almost sacred. "This can't be it," Sarah whispered. But when she glanced toward the entrance of the driveway, she saw the small wooden mailbox. 2 words were carved neatly into the wood. Whispering Pines. Noah slowly stepped out of the car, staring up at the house in amazement. Sarah followed him, the brass key trembling slightly in her hand. She walked slowly up the wooden steps toward the front door. For a moment she hesitated. Then she slid the key into the lock. The heavy oak door creaked open. Warm golden light spilled into the hallway. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar wood and fresh coffee, as if someone had been there only hours earlier. Sarah stepped inside cautiously. The interior felt warm and welcoming. Soft rugs on the wooden floors, worn leather chairs beside a stone fireplace, and shelves filled with books. But something else immediately caught her attention. The photograms. Dozens of framed photographs lined the hallway walls. Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding. They were pictures of her. Sarah in the garden back at the Whitmore estate. Noah learning to ride a bike. Noah blowing out birthday candles. Moments she had never realized anyone had captured. Her knees nearly gave out. Robert had taken them. A calm voice suddenly spoke from the living room. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Sarah turned quickly. An elderly man in a dark suit stepped forward. She recognized him instantly. Mr. Harris, Robert Whitmore's longtime attorney. He held a sealed envelope in his hand, stamped with Robert's initials. "Your husband asked me to give you this personally," Harris said gently. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. But while she opened it, Noah was still staring at the photographs on the wall. One picture hung slightly crooked. Curious, he lifted it from the wall. On the back of the frame was a small handwritten message. "For Noah, when the truth matters." Noah frowned. Then he noticed something else.
Behind the frame, hidden carefully in the wooden paneling of the wall, was a small metal keypad. Noah stared at it. The numbers were worn, as if someone had pressed them many times before. "Mom?" he called softly. "You need to see this." Noah stood in the hallway, staring at the small metal keypad hidden behind the picture frame. The panel was carefully built into the wooden wall, almost impossible to notice unless someone knew exactly where to look. The numbers on the keypad were slightly worn, as if someone had pressed them many times over the years. "Mom," Noah called again, "you need to see this." Sarah looked up from the letter she had just opened, wiping the corner of her eye before walking toward him. Mr. Harris followed quietly behind her, adjusting his glasses as he examined the hidden panel. "Well," he said calmly, "I suppose you've just discovered the next part of Robert's instructions." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. She glanced down at the letter in her hands. Robert's handwriting covered the page, neat and steady, just like the man himself had always been. The final paragraph caught her attention. "If Noah finds what I left behind, you'll finally understand the truth I never had the courage to say out loud." Sarah looked back at the wall. "A safe?" she asked quietly. Mr. Harris nodded. "Yes, Robert had it installed about 3 years ago." Noah leaned closer to the keypad. "I think I know the code," he said. Sarah blinked in surprise. "You do?" Noah pointed to the photograph he had just removed from the wall. On the back of the frame, written in small black ink, was a string of numbers. "My birthday," Noah said softly. He turned back toward the keypad and slowly pressed the numbers. For a moment, nothing happened. The hallway remained completely silent. Then a soft mechanical click echoed from inside the wall. The wooden panel slid open. Behind it sat a steel safe, neatly built into the structure of the house. Inside were several thick folders filled with documents, a leather-bound case, and a small black flash drive. Mr. Harris carefully removed the flash drive and walked to a nearby desk where a laptop sat waiting. "This is likely the most important part," he said. He plugged the drive into the computer. The screen flickered for a moment before a video file appeared. Mr. Harris clicked play. A few seconds later, Robert Whitmore appeared on the screen. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Robert looked older than Noah remembered. His hair was grayer and his face had grown thinner. But his calm expression and steady voice were exactly the same. "Hello, Noah," Robert said gently. Sarah placed her hand over her mouth. "If you're watching this, then you found the safe, which means you followed the clues." He paused for a moment, as if carefully choosing his next words. "There are some things I need to explain to both of you." Robert leaned slightly closer to the camera. "The companies Victoria and Chloe inherited aren't what they think they are." Mr. Harris opened one of the folders from the safe and spread the documents across the desk. Inside were financial statements, tax records, and legal agreements. "For years," Robert continued in the video, "my daughters believed they were helping manage the business. I allowed them to think they were gaining control." Another quiet pause filled the room. "But the truth is," Robert said, "those companies are drowning in debt." Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. "Hidden tax obligations, unstable investments, and risky development projects. It's all there in the records." Mr. Harris slowly nodded as he looked through the documents. "They inherited the empire," Robert continued calmly, "but they also inherited every trap built into it." Noah glanced at his mother. "So, they're broke?" he asked quietly. Mr. Harris closed the folder. "Worse," he replied. "Those companies could collapse under legal investigations if the debts are uncovered." Sarah looked back at the screen. "Then what did you leave for us?" she whispered. Mr. Harris slid the leather document case across the desk. Inside was a thick trust agreement. The title at the top read, "Whispering Pines Private Trust." There were also documents for a private investment fund and an international bank account worth more money than Sarah could even begin to comprehend. Robert's voice continued through the laptop speakers. "I spent too many years staying silent," he said. "I told myself it was to keep peace in the family." He shook his head slowly. "That was my greatest mistake." Robert looked directly into the camera. "Sarah, you deserved better, and Noah deserved a future without the battles that destroyed our family." Sarah squeezed Noah's hand tightly. "For the first time in my life," Robert continued, "I made sure the right people were protected." The video ended. The room remained silent. For the first time since Robert's death, Sarah understood something clearly. Robert had never abandoned them. He had been protecting them all along. 6 months later, winter had quietly settled over Whispering Pines. Snow covered the tall pine trees surrounding the property,
and the lake behind the house had begun to freeze along its edges. What had once been an unfamiliar place now felt like home. Sarah's life had changed in ways she never imagined. At 60, she had expected the rest of her life to be quiet and predictable. Instead, she had found herself rebuilding everything from the ground up. The trust Robert created ensured that Sarah and Noah would never struggle financially. But money was no longer the most important thing in her life. Freedom was. For the first time in decades, she felt it. No charity galas, no silent tension at dinner tables, no walking on eggshells inside a mansion that never truly belonged to her. Just quiet mornings, open land, and the peaceful sound of wind moving through the pines. Then one cold afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. Sarah saw it from the front window. When the doors opened, she immediately recognized the two women stepping out, Victoria and Chloe. But they looked very different from the confident sisters who had sat in Robert's library months earlier. Their businesses had collapsed under the weight of hidden debts and legal investigations. The empire they inherited crumbled faster than anyone expected. Victoria walked up the porch steps first and knocked firmly on the door. "We need to talk," Victoria said sharply. "There's nothing left to discuss," Sarah replied calmly. Chloe's voice trembled with anger. "You planned this." Before Sarah could answer, Noah walked into the room carrying a laptop. "Actually," he said calmly, "Dad did." He placed the laptop on the table and pressed play. Robert's recorded message appeared on the screen once again. "If my daughters are watching this," Robert's voice said steadily, "then you've already gone further than I hoped you would have." Victoria's face slowly lost its color. The room fell silent. As the video ended, no one spoke. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You should leave." And this time, they did. There was no shouting, no threats, only quiet defeat. Later that evening, Sarah stood on the wide front porch of Whispering Pines. The winter sun slowly dipped behind the distant hills, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and pink. Across the open fields, Noah rode a horse through the snow, laughing as the cold wind rushed past him. Sarah watched him with a quiet smile. For the first time in 20 years, she felt light. Not because she had won, but because she had finally stepped out of a life that never truly belonged to her. Sometimes, losing everything is not the end of the story. Sometimes, it is simply the beginning of a better one. And the real question this story leaves behind is simple. If life gave you a second chance, would you have the courage to start again?